July 14th, 1976. It is Bastille Day in France. Fireworks usually light up the night sky across the country. But in the small village of Travez, the explosions on the ground are real. Molotov cocktails strike the wooden walls. Windows shatter instantly. The smell of gasoline mixes with the smoke. The footage shows a secluded farmhouse engulfed in a wall of fire. Inside the inferno, a 61-year-old man does not run. He does not call for help. Instead, he prepares for battle. He grabs a pistol, he shoulders a .22 caliber rifle, he fires blindly through the breaking glass, he shoots at shadows moving in the yard, he empties the magazine into the darkness. Why didn't he flee through the back exit? He had time. But the soldier inside him refused to retreat. The roof collapses, the shooting stops, the fire consumes everything. Firefighters battle the blaze until dawn. The heat is intense. When the smoke clears, they enter the ruins. They find a body, but it does not look like a man. The corpse is charred black. It has shrunk to barely a meter in length. The arms and legs are burned away entirely. The skull is split open from the temperature. Nearby lie the melted remains of his weapons. They identify him by his teeth. Joachim Peiper. At first glance, a quiet retiree living in the French countryside. But in reality, the SS Standartenführer, known as the Beautiful Beast. 30 years passed since the Second World War ended. Courts failed, governments moved on. But someone remembered, this was not a random attack, it was an execution. For decades, Peiper mocked justice. He worked as an executive at Porsche. He lived in comfort. He signed autographs for admirers. He believed his atrocities at Malmedy were forgotten history. He was wrong. The transition was brutal. One day, he was Hitler's golden boy, untouchable and proud. The next, he was a shrunken, headless piece of charcoal on a wet floor. Evil thought it had escaped. But the past finally caught up. January 30th, 1915. On this day, a future war criminal took his first breath in Berlin. The boy was born into a respectable middle-class family. But his father, Waldemar Peiper, was not just a civilian. He was a living scar of the German Empire. Waldemar had served as an officer in the brutal colonial campaigns of German Southwest Africa. He returned from the front wounded, plagued by malaria and hardened by violence. This heritage defined the household. Young Joachim grew up surrounded by a specific atmosphere, the smell of old leather uniforms, the stories of battles lost, the rigid demand for discipline. In this house, duty and honor were not just words, they were the only currency that mattered. His father raised Joachim and his two brothers with a singular purpose: to believe in Germany's absolute greatness, to view military service as the highest form of existence, to never question a superior. Why did Joachim struggle in his early years? He wasn't stupid, but he lacked focus. His grades were mediocre. The doors to a university education were firmly shut. He seemed aimless. But in 1933, the world shifted. Adolf Hitler seized power. The Weimar Republic collapsed. The streets filled with brown shirts and torches. 18-year-old Peiper saw his chance. He didn't need a degree. He needed a cause. He joined the Hitler Youth alongside his brother Horst. A year later, he enlisted in the SS. This was not the regular army. This was a cult. The SS viewed themselves as the racial elite, the architects of the Thousand-Year Reich. Peiper was the perfect recruit. The archival footage shows him clearly. He is tall, blonde, and physically sharp. He looks like a propaganda poster brought to life. He was young, ideologically malleable, and dangerously ambitious. In 1935, at just 20 years old, he graduated. He was accepted into the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. Originally, this unit was the dictator's personal bodyguard. It was the absolute cream of the crop. Peiper had arrived. He was clean-cut and intelligent. He knew how to please his superiors. This talent caught the eye of the most dangerous men in the regime. In 1938, he officially joined the Nazi Party. By 1940, his ascent was vertical. He was selected as the personal adjutant to Heinrich Himmler. Picture this: a 25-year-old officer sitting at the right hand of the Reichsfuhrer SS. At first glance, a prestigious desk job, but in reality, a front-row seat to genocide. Peiper worked for the man who controlled the entire terror apparatus. He sat in the meetings where the extermination of European Jews was calculated like a budget report. He handled the files. He organized the schedules. He saw the maps of the East. The sound of typewriters in that office dictated the deaths of millions, and the record is clear. He never objected. He never looked away. He simply did his job. During this time, he solidified his position in the inner circle. He married Sigrid Henriksson, one of Himmler's own secretaries. They produced 3 children. It was the image of the perfect Aryan family. A successful career, a loyal wife, a pure ideology. Everything was aligned. But this was only the beginning. Peiper was not content with paperwork. He did not want to be a staff officer in a clean uniform. He wanted the mud. He wanted the Iron Cross. In 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. Peiper requested a transfer. He rejoined the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler as a company commander. Events accelerated. He left the corridors of power for the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. The paved roads of Berlin were replaced by the endless Russian steppe. The camera records the shift: dust, roaring tanks, and burning villages. He asked for combat. Now he would drown in it. The true war had begun. The Eastern Front stripped away the mask. It revealed the monster hiding inside the commander. Joachim Peiper didn't just fight, he hunted. His unit swept through the south, pushing toward the Black Sea and Taganrog. Commanders praised his speed, but the cost was buried in the mud. Peiper drove his men until they collapsed or died. To him, soldiers were fuel. Casualties were just numbers on a daily report. Victory was the only metric that mattered. By 1943, he commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 2nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Then came the Third Battle of Kharkov. The mission was suicide: break the Soviet encirclement and rescue the 325th Infantry Division. Peiper invented a nightmare. He didn't wait for dawn. His armored half-tracks roared into villages at night. The drivers slammed the accelerators. Gunners opened fire on every shadow. The darkness lit up with tracer fire. Bullets tore through wooden walls. Straw roofs caught fire instantly. The chaotic tactic had a purpose. It created panic. It created hell. Why did they call them the Blowtorch Battalion? The German propaganda machine claimed it was because of their searing speed. But Soviet survivors knew the truth. At first glance, a military unit, but in reality, a squad of arsonists. Peiper loved the flames. He watched villages turn to ash from the commander's hatch. The screaming terror of the civilians fueled his reputation. Events accelerated. On February 17, 1943, the unit rolled into Krasnaya Poliana. They found German bodies in the snow. They were mutilated. Peiper looked at the corpses. He gave the order without hesitation: burn it all. His men grabbed jerry cans. They poured gasoline on the timber. The soldiers didn't distinguish between combatants and farmers. Elderly men were dragged into the street. Women were shot on their doorsteps. In Peiper's mind, anyone breathing was a partisan. The village disappeared in a wall of fire. Witnesses later counted dozens of civilian bodies. But this was only a warm-up. 5 days prior, near Yefremovka and Semyonovka, retreating Soviets had wounded 2 SS officers. The price for 2 wounded Germans was 872 Russian lives. The SS returned on February 17th to collect the debt. They went house to house. They dragged families out into the freezing air. Men, women, infants wrapped in rags. The crowd was separated. Execution squads raised their rifles and fired into the lines. But for 240 people, a worse fate waited. Soldiers herded them into the wooden church in Yefremovka. The heavy doors slammed shut. The lock clicked. Smoke began to curl from the windows. Gasoline soaked the outer walls. A single match struck. The building became an oven. The screams inside drowned out the roar of engines. The entire village listened in horror. Inside the inferno, a 14-year-old boy named Ivan Kiselev found a window. He smashed the glass. He threw himself into the snow and crawled away. He was the only witness left alive. For this massacre, Berlin did not punish Joachim Peiper. They pinned the Knight's Cross to his chest. March 9th, 1943. The date marked the peak of his career. Joachim Peiper received the Knight's Cross, the highest military decoration the regime could offer. But it wasn't just a medal. It was a coronation. Heinrich Himmler personally took to the airwaves. On a live broadcast, the Reichsführer's voice crackled through the speakers. He called Peiper, "My dear Joachim." Nazi propaganda seized the moment. They painted him as a tactical genius, a natural leader, a man who made decisions in a split second and commanded absolute loyalty. The SS newspaper, Das Schwarze Korps, printed his face on the front page. They labeled him the master of every situation, bold, unorthodox. They manufactured a hero. And Peiper didn't just accept the fame, he reveled in it. He loved every second of the attention. But the celebrity was built on blood. Over the following months, Peiper's unit tore through the Eastern Front. November and December 1943. The fighting in Ukraine turned into a calculated slaughter. Eyewitnesses confirmed the orders: take no prisoners, leave no one behind. The numbers are staggering. In just 48 hours, December 5th and 6th, his men executed 2,280 Soviet soldiers, men who had already surrendered. Then came Pekarchchina. The village ceased to exist. Flamethrowers spewed liquid fire. Houses burned. Inhabitants burned. The footage would show nothing but charred ruins. And Peiper? He stood by and watched. January 1944. Peiper turned 29. Adolf Hitler personally pinned the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross. It should have been a moment of triumph. At first glance, a celebrated hero. But in reality, a broken man. The non-stop killing had drained him. His hands shook. His eyes were hollow. SS doctors examined him and delivered a rare diagnosis: total exhaustion. Even by the brutal standards of the SS, the violence had taken its toll. He was ordered to rest, but the story twists here. Why would a mass murderer show mercy? It defies logic. Back in 1943 in Italy, local authorities captured a group of Jews. The plan was simple: hand them over to the SS, send them to the death camps. Peiper intervened. He didn't ignore it. He demanded custody of the prisoners. Then, he opened the gates. He set them free. A rabbi among them later wrote a testimony. He documented Peiper's unexpected mercy. How do you reconcile this? A man who burns children in Ukrainian churches saves lives in Italy. Perhaps it wasn't about morality. It was about control, the absolute power to decide who breathes and who dies. The mercy was a fluke. The cruelty was the rule. September 1943, the village of Boves, northern Italy. Partisans captured 2 of Peiper's soldiers. Peiper issued an ultimatum: release them or else. The partisans refused. The response was immediate. Peiper ordered reprisals. The sound of gunfire erupted. 23 Italian civilians fell dead. The village went up in flames. Years later, justice tried to catch up. Italian prosecutors filed charges for the Boves massacre, but the legal system failed. In 1968, courts in Germany and Italy cited insufficient evidence. The case was dropped. Peiper walked away a free man. December 1944. By this date, the war was mathematically lost. The Soviet machine crushed from the east, the Americans and British squeezed from the west. Yet Hitler attempted one final suicidal gamble. He ordered a massive counteroffensive through the dense Ardennes forest. The plan was simple and desperate: split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. History names this the Battle of the Bulge, but for the soldiers on the ground, it was a meat grinder. Leading the spearhead stood Joachim Peiper. He commanded Kampfgruppe Peiper, a force of 117 tanks, 700 vehicles, 5,000 men. Hitler expected Peiper to reach the Meuse River in days. Peiper swore he would not fail. December 17th, the second day of the attack. Peiper's column raced westward, tearing up the asphalt. Near the Belgian town of Malmedy, at the Bonnier crossroads, they spotted a target. An American convoy was moving south. This was Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. These were rear echelon troops. They had trucks and maps, not heavy armor. Why did the Americans stop? It seemed they had a chance to run, but Peiper's speed eliminated that option. German tanks opened fire instantly. The lead vehicle exploded. The rear truck shattered. The convoy was immobilized. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned. 113 men threw down their rifles. They raised their hands. At first glance, a standard surrender, but in reality, a death trap. Peiper did not stay. He signaled his driver and continued the advance west. He later claimed he left the prisoners for the rear guard. But what happened next cemented Peiper's name in the books of infamy. The SS soldiers herded the Americans into a snowy field. The prisoners stood unarmed. They waited for transport trucks. Then, a single order cut the air. Machine guns opened fire. The rows of men collapsed. The sound of screaming drowned out the engines. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The camera recreates the scene. Steam rises from the hot gun barrels. Bodies lie in chaotic piles on the white snow. But the SS were not finished. Soldiers walked calmly among the fallen. They looked for movement. They executed the wounded with point-blank shots to the head. Some Americans played dead, holding their breath while blood pooled around them. Others sprinted for the tree line. Most were cut down. A few lucky ones vanished into the woods. When the shooting finally stopped, 84 American soldiers lay dead at the crossroads. This was only the beginning. Peiper's Kampfgruppe pushed deeper into Belgium. They murdered systematically, prisoners of war, Belgian civilians, anyone who blocked the path. By January 13, 1945, the offensive stalled. Peiper was forced to retreat. His unit left behind a trail of 362 murdered American prisoners and 111 dead civilians. The report of these atrocities spread through the Allied ranks like a virus. American troops stopped taking SS prisoners. Retaliation became the rule. They shot them on sight. Peiper's offensive failed completely. He abandoned his heavy equipment. He limped back to German lines with only 800 of his original 5,000 men. Yet the regime was not done with him. Even in defeat, he received the swords to his Knight's Cross. Berlin decorated a mass murderer while the Reich collapsed. May 1945. Germany surrendered. Orders came for Peiper to turn himself in to the Americans. He ignored them. He tried to walk home through the ruins. It did not work. American forces hunted him down later that month. They did not execute him in a field. They put him on trial at Dachau. The site of the concentration camp became the final courtroom. May 1946. The location was symbolic. The former Dachau concentration camp transformed into a courtroom. Joachim Peiper stood before the tribunal. He was not alone. 73 other members of his command stood beside him. They faced charges for the Malmedy Massacre. They faced charges for the blood spilled during the Battle of the Bulge. Why did the proceedings spark immediate outrage? The evidence seemed solid, but the foundation was rotten. The prosecution relied heavily on confessions from German prisoners. The defense pushed back immediately. They claimed these words were extracted through pain. They described mock trials. They detailed physical abuse, beatings, hoods over heads, broken bones. Later investigations proved them right. The inquiry had been flawed. Some interrogators had used excessive force to get results. At first glance, a miscarriage of justice. But in reality, the crime remained undeniable. The archives contain the photos. The bodies of 84 American soldiers lay frozen at Baugny. Autopsy reports were clear. Many victims had bullet holes in their heads. Scorch marks indicated point-blank range. They were wounded first. Then they were executed. There was no mistake. Belgian civilians took the stand. They described systematic murder. Survivors of the massacre pointed fingers. They described SS soldiers walking through the field. They stepped over the dying. They finished them off. The weight of the evidence was crushing. July 16, 1946. The gavel came down. Joachim Peiper was found guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. 42 other officers received the same verdict. 22 received life sentences. The rest faced 10 to 20 years in prison. But the hangman never arrived. Public opinion in America began to shift. Questions about the interrogation cells grew louder. A United States Senate committee opened the files. They found significant errors in how evidence was collected. Senator Joseph McCarthy stepped in. He represented Wisconsin. He represented a large German-American voting bloc. He demanded a review. In 1951, the rope was removed. Peiper's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He sat in a solitary cell. He waited on death row for 5 years. He did not know if the next sunrise would be his last. Events accelerated. In 1954, the sentence dropped to 35 years. December 22, 1956. The heavy steel gates opened. Joachim Peiper walked into the winter air. He had served 11.5 years. He was a free man. He was only 41. 41 years old. That was the age of the man selling cars to innocent families. He didn't just survive the war, he thrived in its aftermath. An underground network of former SS officers pulled the necessary strings. First, they found him a spotted Porsche, then at Volkswagen. Peiper put on a cheap suit and worked as a car salesman. It's a chilling image, a convicted war criminal responsible for hundreds of deaths, shaking hands with customers on the showroom floor. Ordinary Germans bought vehicles from a murderer. They wanted to forget the war and move on. Peiper sold them that illusion. But the 1960s changed the game. West Germany opened the cold files. The statute of limitations was not just a date. It was a moving target that kept extending. Why did his former comrades betray him? Loyalty has a limit when prison looms. To reduce their own sentences, former Nazis began to talk. They named names. The evidence mounted on the prosecutor's desk. Multiple witnesses placed Peiper at the scenes of massacres on the Eastern Front. It wasn't vague hearsay. Karl Wolff, Himmler's senior adjutant, pointed the finger. Werner Grotman, the man who succeeded Peiper as adjutant, added his voice to the record. The testimony piled up. Peiper fought back. He denied the facts. He claimed these were lies fabricated by Soviet agents seeking political revenge. In 1972, he reached his breaking point. Fed up with the investigations and what he called Germany's betrayal of its veterans, Peiper ran. He packed his bags and crossed the border into France. He chose Treves, a tiny dot on the map in Haute-Saône in eastern France. The population was barely 200 people. It seemed perfect for a ghost. He bought a house deep in the woods, a secluded property, high fences, guard dogs patrolling the perimeter. At first glance, a retired grandfather enjoying nature, but in reality, a fugitive checking the shadows. His wife Sigurd was dying of cancer, but she stayed with him when she could. His adult children visited occasionally, but mostly he was alone with his dogs. Peiper needed money, so he worked as a freelance translator. He used the pseudonym Rainer Buschmann. He translated military history books from English to German for a publisher in Stuttgart. He lived quietly. He kept his head down. He thought the woods would protect him. But he made one critical mistake. Arrogance blinded him. Despite using a fake name for his work, he walked into the town hall and registered under his real name, Joachim Peiper. It was there on the official records. In 1974, the clock started ticking. A former French resistance fighter saw the name. He recognized the face. He didn't confront Peiper on the street. He contacted the French Communist Party. For 2 years, historians worked in the dark. They dug through dusty Gestapo files. They matched dates. They confirmed the identity. They documented the crimes. Events accelerated. On June 21, 1976, the French communist newspaper Le Manat went to print. The headline was not subtle. It screamed from the page, "What is this Nazi doing in France?" The article was a detailed indictment. It listed Peiper's war crimes, the murders in Ukraine, the massacre at Malmedy, the deaths of Soviet and American soldiers, the slaughter of civilians, the village of Travs erupted, the silence of the woods was broken. Some residents had always suspected Peiper was hiding something. Now they held the proof in their hands. July 14th. That was the deadline. Most neighbors had no idea who lived next door. They saw a quiet old man. But the past does not stay buried. The vandalism started slowly. Someone threw eggs at his siding. Red paint splashed against the white walls. Then came the letters. They were not polite requests. They were death threats. In the nearby town of Vesoul, graffiti appeared on a wall. It read, "Peiper, we are going to do July 14th for you." July 14th is Bastille Day, the French national holiday. The day tyranny was overthrown. The message was unmistakable. Peiper contacted the local police. He requested protection. They sent a guard to the property. But there was a limitation. The guard only remained on duty during daylight hours. When the sun went down, the police left. At night, Peiper was on his own. The German embassy in Paris assessed the danger. They recommended Peiper leave France immediately. Friends urged him to cross the border back into Germany, but he refused. Why did he stay? He had the money in the car to escape, but his pride became a death sentence. He had grown attached to his isolated house in the French woods. He refused to run. Perhaps he thought the threats were empty words. Perhaps after surviving the Eastern Front, he believed he was invincible. Or maybe he knew the truth. Justice had finally found him. Running would only delay the inevitable result. But this was only the warning. On July 13th, 1976, the harassment escalated. The phone rang constantly. The letters became specific. The voices promised to burn his house. They promised to slaughter his dogs. They did not explicitly say they would kill him. But the implication was clear. That same day, Peiper made a choice. His wife, Sigurd, packed her bags. She got into their BMW. Some sources say she drove to visit a friend in Strasbourg. Others claim she went to their son in Frankfurt. The destination is irrelevant. The fact remains, Joachim Peiper sent her away. He knew danger was approaching. After the car disappeared down the road, Peiper sat at his desk. He wrote 2 letters. One was addressed to Rudolf Lehmann, his former chief of staff. The ink hit the paper. Peiper described his quiet haven as an entrenched camp. He wrote that he hoped to move in the autumn if the communists allow me to wait until then. The tone was not frantic. It was resigned, fatalistic. He knew they were coming. July 14th, 1976, Bastille Day. While France celebrated with fireworks, a group of armed men moved through the forest. They approached Peiper's house under the cover of darkness. Their identity remains a mystery. No arrests were made. Later, a group calling themselves the Avengers took credit. French authorities never identified a single member. At first glance, a random act of violence, but in reality, a calculated military operation. Some believe they were former resistance fighters. Others suspect communists. Some even point to former Soviet or American prisoners of war who survived Peiper's units. 1 in the morning. The attack began. The assailants moved with speed and method. They approached from 3 directions simultaneously to cut off escape routes. They smashed the windows. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Molotov cocktails flew through the jagged openings. Bottles filled with gasoline. Rags stuffed in the necks. The rags were lit. These were crude incendiary devices, but devastating. The house erupted. Forensic investigators later found evidence. Fires were started in 3 separate rooms at the exact same time. The wooden structure became a furnace. Inside, Joachim Peiper grabbed his weapons. He held a .22 caliber rifle and a pistol. He did not hide. He ran outside. The scene was chaotic. Peiper fired into the shadows. Muzzle flashes lit up the yard. Spent shell casings found on the ground confirmed he discharged both weapons multiple times, but he was alone. He was vastly outnumbered. The attackers had positioned themselves strategically in the dark. Peiper fired into the night, but he hit nothing. Something terrified him. Witnesses later speculated he saw the sheer number of attackers, or perhaps he realized the house was already lost. He retreated back inside. Maybe he thought he could defend the interior. Maybe he panicked. We will never know his final thoughts. The flames spread rapidly. The smoke became thick, black, and choking. Outside, the violence continued. The attackers turned their weapons on the animals. They fired into the kennel. 4 bullets were recovered, 3.35mm rounds from a small caliber pistol. The dogs were hit. They bled on the concrete floor. The attackers did not kill them. They left them wounded to suffer in the smoke. The trap was closed. 11:30 at night. At that exact moment, the roof collapsed. Whether Peiper heard the dogs dying outside is unknown. The roar of the flames drowned out every other sound. He remained inside the inferno. He was trapped, perhaps by choice, perhaps by the falling timber. He did not run. The intense heat shattered the windows. The smoke filled the hallways. The fire closed in from all sides. His last minutes were a mirror of his own crimes. The terror he felt was the same terror he had inflicted. He likely remembered the villagers in Yefremovka, screaming as they burned alive in their wooden church. He remembered the American soldiers in Malmedy, gunned down in the freezing Belgian snow. He remembered the Soviet prisoners executed in the open fields of Ukraine. Now, the fire was collecting the debt. Firefighters arrived hours later. They sprayed water on glowing embers, but there was nothing to save. The house was gone. It was reduced to a black smoking shell. Inside the ruins, amidst the ash and debris, they found an object. It looked like a log, but it was a body, or what remained of one. The corpse measured barely 1 meter long. The fire had been merciless. The arms were gone. The legs were gone, burned completely away. The torso was blackened, shriveled, and hard as leather. The skull was split open from the heat. The scene was frozen in violence. Near the hand-like appendages, investigators found a pistol and a rifle. They were positioned carefully. It looked as if Peiper had been defending himself against the flames with bullets until the very end. The autopsy revealed a grim detail. The lungs were full of smoke. This confirmed a painful truth. Joachim Peiper was alive when the fire started. He breathed in the toxic fumes. He choked on the thick black air. He died from asphyxiation, gasping for breath before the flames cooked his flesh. But this was only the beginning. The next day, Peiper's widow, Sigurd, arrived to claim the remains. The French authorities met her with silence and more bad news. The body had been mutilated post-mortem. Inside the morgue, someone had desecrated the corpse. At first glance, a standard medical examination, but in reality, a final act of savage revenge. The head was missing. When it was finally returned to the widow, it was a puzzle of bone shards. The skull had been smashed into pieces. Only a single tooth remained intact. Whether this was done by the attackers returning to the scene or by someone with access to the morgue remains a mystery. The disrespect shown to his corpse was absolute. It perfectly mirrored the disrespect Peiper had shown to thousands of victims 30 years prior. The investigation hit a wall immediately. French police interviewed witnesses. They collected bags of ash. They filed reports, but they made no arrests. A group calling itself the Avengers was suspected. Rumors circulated of photographs showing masked men at the scene, but these photos were never published. Why was the case never solved? The answer is cold and simple. No one wanted to solve it. Peiper was a convicted war criminal. He had cheated the hangman once before. Many people in France felt that justice had merely been delayed. The French newspapers didn't mourn. They barely concealed their satisfaction. Some headlines openly celebrated the murder. The public sentiment was unanimous. Peiper had it coming. The London Times printed 5 words: "Avengers kill SS Colonel in France." That headline acted as a beacon. 3 days later, the roads to the village of Travis were gridlocked. Cars full of sightseers converged on the site. They didn't come to pay respects. They came to gawk. The footage shows tourists walking through the rubble, strangers taking photos of the burnt beams. It was a macabre spectacle. The public was fascinated by the idea that a war criminal could never truly escape, that eventually the past hunts you down. Joachim Peiper's remains were transported back to Germany. He was buried in the cemetery of St. Anna's Church in Schondorf am Ammersee. He was placed alongside his family, a lineage marked by total ruin. His father, his mother, and his two brothers, both victims of their own demons, Hans Hasso, who died of tuberculosis after a suicide attempt left him in a vegetative state, and Horst, who committed suicide after allegations of homosexuality destroyed his reputation. Tragedy defined them, shame followed them. The fire simply finished the job, thus ended the bloodline. July 14th, 1976. On this specific night, the flames finally caught up with him. Who exactly was Joachim Peiper? The archives offer two conflicting versions, but the charred ruins of his home provided the only answer that mattered. Was he a brilliant tactician unfairly targeted by the victors, or a monster who turned war into a slaughterhouse? The debate ends when you look at the ground. The facts are undeniable. Peiper's hands were not just dirty, they were soaked in blood, civilian blood, prisoner blood, the blood of unarmed men, women, and children. It does not matter if he personally pulled every trigger. It does not matter if he struck every match. He commanded the units. He built the machine. Peiper created a culture of absolute brutality. He didn't just tolerate war crimes, he expected them. He encouraged them. At Malmedy, the snow turned red. 84 American soldiers lay dead. Even if Peiper didn't shout the specific order to fire, he bore the weight of command. His subordinates knew the drill. Speed was everything. Prisoners were luggage. Luggage slows you down. The logic was cold and simple. Take no prisoners, keep moving. Those Americans died because Peiper's unit viewed them as obstacles, not humans protected by the Geneva Convention. But this was only the beginning. On the Eastern Front, the evidence turns even darker. Multiple witnesses stood forward. They testified that Peiper personally ordered villages erased from the map, not evacuated, burned, often with the inhabitants locked inside. The footage shows thatched roofs collapsing in a storm of sparks. He was described as eager. He didn't hesitate to execute the scorched earth policy. The nickname Blowtorch Battalion wasn't a term of endearment. It was a reputation earned with gasoline and matches. It was earned through systematic industrial destruction. At first glance, a military operation, but in reality, a mobile extermination squad. This brings us to the uncomfortable question, the moral trap. If Peiper deserved to die for these crimes, and the numbers suggest he did, why was vigilante justice acceptable? The legal system had its chance. He was tried, he was convicted, he was sentenced. Then, the system failed. Sentences were commuted, politics intervened, he served his time. 11.5 years. For the magnitude of his crimes, it was a blink of an eye. But by 1976, he was a free man. He was a private citizen living legally in France. He bought bread. He walked his dog. His killers were not soldiers. They were murderers. They surrounded his house in the dark. They threw Molotov cocktails. They burned a man alive without a judge, without a jury, and without a warrant. Does the victim's past make the killers heroes? Or just criminals with a better motive? The answer reveals more about the observer than the event. Many celebrated Peiper's death. They called it poetic justice. The man who burned villages burned in his own home. The man who showed no mercy received none. Events accelerated. The rule of law collapsed into vendetta. If we applaud this, we set a dangerous standard. It implies that any killing is justified if the target is bad enough. Justice descends into revenge. However, the alternative is equally bitter. If legal processes fail, what happens next? If war criminals walk free after a decade, is justice served? Are we supposed to accept that mass murderers can retire to the countryside, that they can live comfortably selling cars while their victims lie in mass graves? The Peiper case forces us to look at the ledger. The victims deserve better than silence. 872 villagers murdered at Yefremovka and Semyonovka. 84 American soldiers executed at Malmedy. 2,280 Soviet prisoners shot in just 2 days. Hundreds of others whose names are lost to history. They got death. Peiper got 11.5 years in a cell. Then he got 20 years of freedom. He worked, he lived, he enjoyed the silence of his secluded house in the French countryside, until that night in July. Someone decided the waiting was over. Someone decided that justice delayed was justice denied. They took the law into their own hands. Was Peiper's death justice or murder? The answer is probably both. And that is the disturbing core of this story. In the gap between what the law provided and what morality demanded, violence became inevitable. The camera records. The aftermath is a smoking shell of a building. Joachim Peiper died exactly as he lived, surrounded by flames, inflicting violence until the final second. He didn't surrender to the fire. He grabbed a weapon. He fired blindly into the darkness at enemies he couldn't see. When the authorities found him, the body was a shriveled husk. It was barely recognizable as human. It mirrored the charred remains he had left behind across Europe. There is a grim symmetry here. The measure you give is the measure you get. But unlike his victims, Peiper had 30 years. He had 3 decades to breathe free air before the fire came for him. The account was finally closed. 30 years. That was the time given to him to reflect. Did he use it to apologize? One might expect remorse from an old man near the end of his life, but Peiper remained stone. Until his final breath, he defended the uniform. He defended the swastika. He claimed the courts lied. He insisted the witnesses were paid actors. "I was a soldier," he repeated. "I followed orders." He never admitted that the people he killed were human beings, but silence did not save him. When the fire started, he was alone. His wife had left. The phone lines were dead. He sat in his study with a rifle, waiting for the inevitable. The flames consumed the wood. The roof collapsed. He died asphyxiated, shrunk by the heat to a fraction of his size. The ruins of his house in Treves remained standing. They stood for years, a blackened scar on the hillside. Some visitors arrived with flowers to honor a Nazi. Others came to spit on the ground where justice finally struck. In 2016, 40 years later, the debris was still there. The footage shows scorched beams poking out of the dense French undergrowth. Nature was slowly eating the evidence. But the site remained a magnet. It became a destination for dark tourism, a place where the law failed and gasoline succeeded. But this was only the aftermath. Joachim Peiper's story is a warning. Evil does not always wear a monster's mask. Peiper was handsome, he was educated, he spoke multiple languages, his men idolized him, his commanders pinned medals on his chest, Nazi propaganda films zoomed in on his smiling face. At first glance, a chivalrous knight, but in reality, a butcher. Beneath the iron crosses, he was a man who burned villages. He was a commander who ordered the execution of unarmed prisoners. His death was brutal. But for his victims, it was 3 decades late. It was not a court verdict. It was a Molotov cocktail thrown in the dark. It was a violation of the law. The same law Peiper had ignored his entire career. So what is the lesson here? That war criminals should sleep with one eye open? That if the judge waits too long, the executioner will come from the street? Yes, all of this is true. But the timeline reveals a deeper truth. The crimes were not accidents, they were choices. Events accelerated at Yefremovka. Peiper stood before a wooden church. Inside were hundreds of civilians. He could have walked away. Instead, he ordered the doors locked. He ordered the torches lit. He listened to the screams until the roof fell in. There was no mistake at Malmedy. He saw American prisoners with their hands raised. He could have followed the Geneva Convention. Instead, he gave the signal. The machine guns opened fire. At every crossroad, he chose death. He chose cruelty. He chose to serve the regime. And 30 years later, on a humid summer night in France, those choices returned. They climbed the hill. They broke the window. They set his world on fire. Are there other monsters living in quiet suburbs today? Are there men who think their medals protect them from the past? Write your thoughts below. Subscribe for more investigations. Because evil does not expire, it just hides. Sometimes it takes a lifetime, but eventually the bill comes due. Ask the ashes of Joachim Peiper.